Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much. This is a great crowd. There will be a test at the end of this, which is why you have the desks with little tables next to them. No, welcome. I'm John Ahlquist. I'm a faculty member here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, which is where you're sitting right now, if you're not familiar with that. So I'd like to, on behalf of the other faculty, our students, our staff and administrators, let me just extend a welcome to you from GPS and from UCSD. For those of you who don't know, just since this is kind of a joint collaboration between GPS and the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, GPS is a professional school. So we offer basically master's degrees for public policy, international affairs. We also offer a specialized degree in master's in Chinese economic and political affairs, as well as some executive degrees. So that's what we do here. That's why we're kind of our raison d'etre for UCSD. But this is our 30th anniversary year as a school. And one of the things we want to do for our 30th anniversary, which I think fits the UCSD ethos pretty well, is UCSD is a young school, GPS is a young school. We're forward-looking, we're excited about the future, we want to see the kind of future we can build, so we want to do at least part of our celebration for our 30th anniversary, looking 30 years into the future and thinking about how to do that. And so our 30th anniversary, there's going to be a variety of events all year long, some of them associated with San Diego 2049, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and some of them separate. But all of them are going to come under at least one of three themes, so I'll just tell you what they are. They're crafting 21st century policy. That's the first. The second is fusing technology and policy. And the third is navigating an evolving political economy. And one of the things I'm excited about for San Diego 2049 is that it does or encompasses or touches all of those themes in a pretty exciting way. So this event tonight that I'm thrilled about is the kickoff event for San Diego 2049 that's going to continue all through the 2018-2019 academic year. There's going to be events at least once a quarter all year long. And one of the big events that's really going to culminate the year is a competition for graduate students at UCSD. So I just want to say real quick, this is a competition that is open to all graduate students across UCSD, regardless of your department or discipline. You can be an MBA student at Rady, you can be an engineering school over at the Jacobs School of Engineering, you can be down at Scripps, you can be in health sciences, and you can be any of the other departments at UCSD. But our goal is to get teams of graduate students together to think seriously and hard and in groups about the future of the San Diego region 30 years from now, in hopefully a way that's exciting and interesting and positive. We're living kind of skewing to the dystopian in the world, so hopefully we can turn that around. And so we want to link our strengths in science fiction, in human imagination, in design, in humanities and cultural studies with existing strengths in political science, economics, social science, policymaking, and also the natural sciences and engineering to get hands-on experience in futurist thinking and world building and get students to produce interventions into this future they hope to build. And at the end of the year, we'll have a big competition, there'll be prizes, and there'll also be the opportunity to earn a certificate in speculative design for public policy for all the students that participate all year long. So that's what San Diego 2049 is all about. So I want to hand this off and get this going real quick. So I really want to acknowledge our partner in this, which is the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, including Patrick Coleman, who's been super helpful. He's floating around. You may have seen him. I also want to acknowledge Wendy Hunter Barker from GPS, who's done a huge amount of work making sure this event goes off seamlessly and well. So I'd like to just acknowledge them real quick. Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Shelley Streamy, who's going to introduce our main event for the evening.
Thank you, John. I'm very excited about all these events that we have coming up in the year ahead. So I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination and the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop at UCSD. I'm Shelley Streamy, and I'm a professor of literature and ethnic studies at UCSD. And Clarion has been something very close to my heart. I've been faculty director since 2010. And also an affiliate of the Clarke Center. And just to tell you a little bit more about the Clarke Center, their mission is to understand the neural, cognitive, and social components of imagination, to foster engagement between the arts and humanities and sciences, and to promote the study of speculative culture. So the Clarion Workshop, which takes place over 6 weeks at the summer in UCSD, is also housed within the Clarke Center. Clarion is the oldest and most prestigious workshop of its kind in the world. And since 1968, some of the world's greatest science fiction and fantasy writers and world builders have been teachers and students for us, including Octavia Butler, Ted Chiang, N.K. Jemisin, Kim Stanley Robinson, and many, many more great names. Because of Clarion's presence on campus, the Clarke Center is able to host many exciting events throughout the year, featuring some of the greatest writers of our times, like this recent one with George R.R. Martin and Kim Stanley Robinson. Some of you may have attended. It's a lot of fun. We're excited that this summer our world-renowned faculty include Carmen Maria Machado, Maurice Broaddus, Karen Lord, Andy Duncan, and Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. Jeff is the author of the novel Annihilation, part of the Southern Reach trilogy, which was recently made into a major motion picture. And here he and Anne are in 2016 using creative methods to inspire our writers. If you or anyone you know is an aspiring science fiction writer, please consider applying to this transformative workshop. So each year we receive hundreds of applications, and we get people from all over the world and select 18 students. In recent years, students have ranged in age from 20 to 60, and they come from the Philippines, Singapore, Canada, Italy, Finland, Iran, Australia, England, Spain, and across the United States. And each summer we have 6 famous science fiction writers and editors come in to teach research and craft to the students. Many of them write a new story each week. But while our faculty and students are creative writers, their interests are overwhelmingly interdisciplinary. They use interdisciplinary research in their world building, and many of our students have day jobs as scientists or social justice workers, educators, software engineers, filmmakers, and other kinds of occupations for which interdisciplinary research and world building are crucial. So interdisciplinary research is vital for world building, which is one of the keys to what we do each summer at Clarion. It's a crucial part of the storytelling process. The world created in a science fiction or fantasy story must be complex and multi-layered. It must be a place characters operate in and interact with, and it must set the stage for the plot. World making is also indispensable to any effort to change our world and imagine better futures. And here, this slide shows Clarion 2015 alumna Adrienne Marie Brown. She's an important activist today, and her co-editor Walida Imarisha, who make this argument really beautifully in their collection, Octavia's Brood, Short Stories from Social Justice Movements. And in that book, different leaders of social movements contribute science fiction stories they've crafted and workshopped together that speak to the most pressing issues and problems of our time. So I'm thinking that maybe some of the work the graduate students do will be along these lines. For many years, Brown has been traveling around the U.S. leading world-building workshops with organizations that want to change the world for the better. And she asks communities to discuss problems they need to solve and world-building together to imagine solutions. Imarisha suggests that all organizing is science fiction, and that we are dreaming new worlds every time we think about the changes we need to make in the world. She and Brown talked about this work at a major conference hosted by the Clarke Center and Clarion in 2016, co-organized by myself and Ayanna Jameson, the founder of the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. The 3-day conference, which was called Shaping Change, Remembering Octavia E. Butler Through Archives, Art, and World Making, was an historic gathering of artists, writers, scholars, and students and activists inspired by Butler's memory to shape change and make a better world. These ideas are also central to my new book, Imagining the Future of Climate Change, World Making Through Science Fiction and Activism, which is about social movements led by indigenous people and people of color that are at the forefront of challenging the greatest threat to our environment, the fossil fuel industry. Their stories and movements in the real world and through their world building and science fiction help us all better understand the relationship between activism and culture and how both can be valuable tools in creating our future. So we're lucky to have with us today one of the great science fiction writers who is a master of world building, Vernor Vinge. He's won 5 Hugo Awards, including one for 3 of his novels, A Fire Upon the Deep, A Deepness in the Sky, and Rainbow's End. He's known for his rigorous approach to the science in science fiction, and he became an iconic figure among cybernetic scientists with the publication in 1981 of his novella True Names, which is considered a seminal visionary work of internet fiction. His many books also include Marooned in Real Time and The Peace War. Fascinated by science, and particularly computers from an early age, he has a PhD in computer science and taught mathematics and computer science at San Diego State for 30 years. He's also gained a great deal of attention, both here and abroad, for his theory of the coming machine intelligence singularity. So the format of our talk will be this talk, then a 10-minute Q&A period, and finally a public reception where you will all have the chance to talk to Vernor and get your book signed. So please join me in welcoming Vernor Vinge.
So what you see on the screen is sort of my talking notes, which also includes bibliographical pointers, and hopefully I'll leave this up for a while on the site after tonight if people want to look at some of these pointers. So, as it says there, or we'll say in a minute after I get the mouse to scroll down, no one knows what the future will bring, and yet planning for the future is an essential part of the human condition. And depending on the time scale and the type of problem that we're looking at, there are very different methods that are appropriate for looking at the future. In some of those, mainly mathematical methods, we've had a lot of success. Celestial mechanics, we can predict planetary precisions with extreme accuracy, thousands and even billions of years into the future, leaving aside rogue interlopers, that is, planets that come from outside that we don't even know are there that come through. We've also had good success with mathematical models for the weather. If you have enough fine-grained information and if you have fast enough computers, nowhere near as good as with celestial mechanics, but a week or 2 or 3, depending on the type of thing that we're looking at, can still be very, very useful. On the other hand, in the domain of human affairs, at all time scales and all size scales, we're in terrible trouble. We do very, very badly. And nowadays, that we have technology and the ability to change the ground rules by changing the characteristics of the technology, this is even more true. Someday, this may even affect the things that we are very confident that we can predict, like the weather. And in the case of climate, we already have seen plenty of evidence that humans have the ability to change things. Ultimately, it's to me quite plausible that that the positions of the planets themselves could be subject to human interference. And in the case of our solar system, that would be mostly for the worse. So what sort of tools do we have for planning where humans are involved? Let me look at some things that are more or less science fictional. I think probably 2/3 of the people in this room are probably familiar with Isaac Asimov's notion of psychohistory, which I take as having inspiration not so much in computers or even economics, but in gas laws in physics. The notion that you have statistics that describes things that in the domain of just 1 or 2 gas molecules at a time might be very hard to do, to take together all the physics that's needed to make that work out. But when you scale it up to trillions and much more than trillions of atoms in a gas, we have very consistent statistics that allows us to make good predictions. And so I see Isaac as thinking that the same thing might happen if you had very, very large populations, say much larger even than we have on Earth, say galactic-sized populations. And in his stories, there was also the assumption that technology was much more stable than what we have experienced even in the last 30 years or so. Unfortunately, and as those of you who have read Asimov's Foundation stories have seen, the approach of psychohistory has very severe problems. In his case, mainly again, what individuals can do, even in the case of very large populations. On the other hand, although it's not physics, there is economic modeling, at least in time domains and in other areas where you don't have to worry too much about human meddling. And on that scale, economic modeling actually, I think, has certain success if a person can recognize the domain of validity. There is something that's sort of crept up in the last 5 or 10 years now that we have very large data sets and very, very fast computers and computer networks. And that is the possibility of modeling, say in a nation state like the USA, modeling every person by the data that you have on that person, and building up from that into more and more complicated things. So building up towards stuff that looks a little bit like economic modeling, but is actually based on not smudging out the statistics, but looking at every single individual. And you could imagine even going downwards from that in modeling every individual, and then taking into account what you know about neurobiology. That's very extreme. I think it's pretty obvious that doing something like that quickly can swamp any computer system that we have at the present time, and as far as computer systems we might have in the future, if you're sufficiently optimistic about that sort of computer progress, you come up with a very strange situation. Namely, if you really could do something like this, and it really was accurate, well, boost the speed of the computers a little bit more, and you have a situation where your computers are actually running simulations about the outside world that is progressing faster that is progressing toward conclusions faster than the outside world, and you get a situation where there's sort of perhaps a subsidiary reality. The economist Robin Hanson has written a terrific nonfiction book about this called The Age of M, where M stands for emulations. And it's amazing to me how much really striking conclusions he can reach, mainly by looking at the economics of a situation where you have an environment like that. So dialing back from that sort of extreme speculation in science fiction, let's look at the sort of thing that is really available and has been used for predictions within the human realm. One is the notion of super forecasters. I'm very skeptical of this notion, and in its most naive form, I think everybody here would probably be skeptical. There were a series of stories in the 1950s in astounding science fiction about this idea. And the notion is that basically you go to Las Vegas and you look at who's winning. And the ones who really win a lot, really have never lost, you pick them out and you use them to tell you what's going to happen in the future. And your argument is, well, there was only one chance in 10 million that this person could have been right so much as they were right up till now. So they must have some secret psychic ability, compared to other people who claim to have secret psychic ability, to tell the future. Of course, this ignores the fact that you've been watching a very large population, perhaps of millions or tens of millions, to identify these people that have had this good luck. So that form of super forecasters, I was embarrassed to see written up even as a science fiction story, although the science fiction part of it was that they really did have psychic abilities. On the other hand, there have been studies to try to find out people who actually, by some sort of internal methodologies, do very well, and then try to coax them out and use them as one component of your prediction system. So super forecasters is something I think you will see in non-crazy situations, but it's not. I'm not up to it. Another method, if that's what it can be called, is insider knowledge. Actually very effective, but it also can get you into trouble. Forecasting based on analysis of trends is an obvious one. We got Moore's Law, which has done very well for us and has probably enriched a bunch of people who predict the future and has certainly enriched all of society. At the same time, we have other trends that have been watched. In the 1950s, there was a fellow named G. Harry Stein, who was an engineer, and he pointed out, this was before Moore's Law. He was writing this before Moore's Law had become popular for electronics. He pointed out that if you plot the top speed that a human has been able to move against time over the last 10,000 years, it is at least exponential. And in fact, he was writing in 1961, he said that, by the year 1975, we will have in extrapolating this trend, we will have exceeded the speed of light. And one argument he had for how good his plot was, still before 1975, was that by 1969, he figured we'd be up to the escape velocity of Earth for the fastest humans. And he says, and that's dead on because we have the Apollo project. So that's a really good example of a trend law that didn't work out so well. So Moore's Law, I think, is terrific, and but it is rare. And technology that sort of comes at you out of left field and can only be seen in retrospect is something that we may find that we will see that more in the future. We've had 20 or 30 years here with Moore's Law that has been very comforting. It seems like the future was just sort of laid out on a track. Actually, it was partly laid out in a track by the semiconductor manufacturers who decided exactly how fast it was going to be. So, other methods here, I have 3 more methods on the list here. Decision markets, where you have something like a stock market, but you pay people for what their estimates are if they pan out. The Delphi method, where you have protocols for dealing with people who are recognized as experts. And the thing where I would like to spend my time today, which is scenarios and scenario-based planning. I think all of these last 3 methods are ones that have quite a bit of success with them. And they all illustrate a principle that I think is very important. And that is that humans, if we're going to talk about predicting things in the human domain, difficult as it is, if you don't take advantage of the humans themselves to help you with the process, then you are really, really in trouble. And that the most successful methods that we will have are going to be protocols that somehow use groups of humans with different types of knowledge and different attitudes and different motives in order to have them participate in the protocol and help you devise ways of talking about the future. So scenarios and scenario-based planning are certainly examples of that, but as you can see from the 2 or 3 items before that, there are other methods and other protocols that a person would probably not call scenarios and scenario-based planning. Whichever of these human-based methods that you use or participate in, I think it's important to at the outset, be kind of aware of the frailties of this most powerful tool that you're using, namely humans. Humans have certain canonical failures of attitude and of intuition and of mind. And knowing what those are and knowing what the relative strengths are is really an important thing. And so I put 3 sources up here that the first 2 especially I've had exposure to, and I found them to be terrific books, and they kind of illustrate the places where hubris and blind spots are especially dangerous in systematic ways for humans when they think about planning. The intelligence agencies have also published a lot about this, and I think there it's a more concrete thing and is also very important and tends to be perhaps more quantified. So in focusing on scenarios, maybe I give you my idea of what a scenario is, which really covers the whole area, covers a lot of ground. But what I mean by scenario is a vision of the future of the world at some future time. And it has to be sufficiently comprehensive to give the people who look at it in our present day the context of the situation and how that observer's concerns will have played out in this future world. So it relates what's going on now with the things that are going to happen in the future. I think that scenario builders should work hard to make their visions as plausible as possible. And realize that scenarios are not predictions, and that there's a lot of different ones that should be considered if you want to have some sort of robustness in thinking about the future. So I've had experience in kind of two angles of this business with scenarios. One is in writing my science fiction. And in fact, I think that science fiction stories about the future, at least, can be regarded as scenarios. Almost all of them can be regarded as scenarios. In a way, I like to think that science fiction is to humankind what dreaming is for the individual human. So when we as individuals have a dream, most of our dreams are nonsense. Some of our dreams reveal to us things that are really cool that we might be able to make happen. And some of them are dreams that we think to ourselves and we realize that the dream is a very ugly dream, but it's about a risk that we had underappreciated. And of course, you see all of those things happen in science fiction in almost the same proportions that we have in dreams. One standard technique, for instance, for making science fiction is the if this goes on method, which maybe the most spectacular instance of that is George Orwell's 1984. Then the science fiction writer Ray Bradbury, of course, wrote Fahrenheit 451, and very famously, I think probably a lot of people in this room are aware of his very famous quote where he was asked about his science fiction, and he said, "I don't write these stories to predict the future. I write them to prevent it." And in the case of Fahrenheit 451, I would say that that's definitely the case. If you talk to science fiction writers, you will often find that there's sort of a folk wisdom that they have. I call it a folk wisdom for reasons that I think will become obvious. But the folk wisdom or the folk policy is that when you write a science fiction story, you're allowed one completely wild assumption. And then from that wild assumption, you try to make everything work out consistently with the rest of things that are more or less in agreement with what most people believe about the world and about technology or whatever the problems are in the world that you have. Now, it may seem that this is sort of a completely artificial assumption. For artistic reasons, I think it works out well because it means that you don't have to confuse the reader when the reader reads the story, things hang together because there is this one essential element that may be crazy, but the rest all follows from it. This may not seem of very much use in the real world, but I think actually, especially in scenario planning, it may actually have some use. In fact, we know we're going to be confronted with all sorts of surprising things in the future. However, trying to have scenarios that makes all the surprising things happen at once is probably no good for the people that are trying to make the scenario or for the people who are trying to interpret the scenario. It basically enlarges your problem space to such an enormous degree that it's not very useful. There's one thing about science fiction that may seem to contradict my claim of a few minutes ago where I was saying how to have success in dealing with understanding the future that involves humans, and human problems and human societies, one had to engage a large number of humans with some sort of a protocol where they could contribute in a constructive way to getting at this insight about the future. This may seem to not be the case with science fiction because in science fiction you have one writer or you have one writer and two writers or a co-writer. Rarely do you have more than that. But if you think about it, in fact, science fiction, and if you're in the science fiction field, you're already very intensely aware of this. Science fiction actually, individual stories actually involve a lot of people. Even if the writer has written a story while they were locked up in a closet, if it's ever going to be sold, there will be lots of people reading it. And these people, the science fiction readers, they talk to each other. This was true actually pretty intensely even before the internet. But now, of course, it's obviously true, and it's obvious that a lot of people talk about stories that are popular. This feedback feeds back to the author of the story, when nowadays authors try to write several stories in the same future. It also leaks across to other writers. So if you look at the ongoing body of related stories in the past and the future that are on some particular theme, in a way it's like watching a conversation as these people steal each other's ideas down through time. It's a conversation that in the 20th century, it spanned decades, the whole century in some cases, of writers who would get an idea about something, they would talk about the consequences of that idea, their sales and the intriguing nature of their idea and the interface with the fans would cause the writer another writer perhaps, to write a different sort of a story, but about the same idea. And so, as a whole, in a very emergent way, there was a large number of people that were working on these story themes. I think the fundamental thing about these stories is that the writer has to value logic and internal consistency. There's one particular branch of science fiction called hard science fiction, where, in addition to the last couple sentences that I said, the writer would normally try to bring technology and really consistency with the technology and the science that is currently known with the things that the writer says in the story. Hard science fiction has been where I have generally been at. I think that actually you can have stories that are not particularly recognizable as being associated with any particular science, but that they do still involve a very strong interest in logic, both of the way the characters react and in what's going on. These are especially fun to read if the results are very, very surprising. I think that written fiction and science fiction is a special case of it, is a very interesting art form. That as with most art, it engages the emotions as well as the intellect. But more than any other art form, I would argue that science fiction uses the mind of the observer as a display device. And this has a very interesting effect. This means that a science fiction a science fiction writer of normal intelligence, but very high talent as a science fiction writer, that is, in writing an engaging story that engages the emotions and engages the reader with the ideas, such an averagely intelligent science fiction writer can engage the interest and favorable intention of a Newton or an Einstein or a Tesla. And then, once you've hooked these guys, that genius reader can often go beyond the analysis and insight of the author. And one of the most fun things that I'm not saying this has ever happened, by the way, but one of the most fun things that can happen to an author is standing around and being approached by some guy they've admired all their life, some super genius, Nobel Prize or whatever, and he comes and says, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, I read your story such and such. And you know that insight about, some gadget in the story? That was really profound. I was amazed that you saw that." And the science fiction writer says, "Yes, that's quite striking, isn't it?" Well, he's madly trying to think of exactly what it was he said that was so filled with genius. So, if this same science fiction writer had a sufficient megalomania, he might say that really good science fiction that's written with these good characters and the action, the technical background, that you can use that to enlist a gang of geniuses that nothing short of a national war effort could engage otherwise. So that's kind of if a person wants to make a big brag about science fiction, that's the most extreme form that I've seen so far. And actually, it has been used in stories. Heinlein had a story called I don't mean the part about the megalomaniacal science fiction writer, but Heinlein had a story called Footfall. I don't know whether I'm sorry, it was Pornell and Niven, right. I'm getting to Heinlein, because Heinlein's a character in the story. And in Footfall, we get invaded from outer space. And so the president says, what are we going to do? And he gets together about a bunch of science fiction writers. And so they brainstorm all these ideas. And so in fact, actually that's one step more maniacal than my claim here, because I think they had bright scientists working with them, but the frame of the story is pretty much how cool these science fiction writers are. And Heinlein is not, actually I said it was about Heinlein. I don't think he appears by name, right?
No, C.J. Cherry does.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, there are several writers that those of us who write science fiction thought we had identified. I thought I had identified Heinlein as one of them. So that's a very fun story, and we do beat the aliens. Now, so that's the science fiction part of my pedigree or my vita. The other one is in a much smaller proportion. Is from about 95 to 2010, there was a company called Global Business Network that occasionally hired me to participate in industrial scenario-based planning. And one of the founders of that organization of Global Business Network is Peter Schwartz. And I cited a couple of his books here that I recommend. So anyway, I was very positively impressed by my experience with GBN. And what I want to tell you about their protocol is based on my recollection, and then part of it is my speculation about how it could be used, not necessarily what they really did, or at least what I saw. So let me tell you about a typical GBN project. So unlike the San Diego 2049 project, which I've looked at on the web, in this case, it was a company that is selling their services to organize a meeting and generate scenarios out of that meeting. So so GBN would have a client company that they would get together and set this up. And the structure of it, at least the ones that I participated in, a single project would consist of the following sort of personnel. You have professional facilitators, team leaders. These would be mainly people from GBN. Then there would be 15 to 30, small classroom size of subject area experts from within the client organization normally. And then there would be 1 to 3, a very small number of invited consultants from outside GBN and from outside the client's organization. I saw two types of people in that last category. One were people that were recognized authorities in the general area that we were studying. So they may not have been part of either of the organizations, but the people in the subject area expert group knew of these people and presumably had quite a bit of respect for them. The other type that I observed in this last group was science fiction writers. And I often thought that we were there chiefly to be loose cannons. Basically, when I tried to keep a low profile and be interesting, and it was nice to be able to say things that turned out to be really stupid, but they were kind because it was recognized that I was outside in science fiction. And as I say here on the slide, I think the reason for my presence there was that I could shake things up without being threatening to anybody. Now, a typical GBN project that I observed went through three phases. One setup phase, where I assume GBN and the client organization got together and decided who the participants were. In particular, of course, who would the employees of the client company be that would attend. And then the second phase was the scenarios creation phase. And this was just 2 or 3 days where we would all sit together, and they were full working days, but there were just 2 or 3 days where we sit together around a table and talk about these things. Now, part of that time had to be spent where the facilitators were essentially describing what the overall process was to get at the scenarios that they wanted to do. And then the devising of the scenario. So that's the place where I was present mostly. and where I thought, amazing performance. The third phase was the deliverables creation. And I was never at any of these. These are meetings to create the formal deliverables, which also has an analog within the San Diego 2049 competition. The creating of these formal deliverables, I was never with those, and so I never wrote a science fiction story in support of a scenario at their request. But I suspect that there was a significant amount of work that went into this last phase, and it was spread over some time, and probably meetings of much smaller groups of people and staff members that I never met, or I never met in that role. So the scenario creation phase, both from the standpoint of I think my interest and my knowledge, is what I'd like to talk about in a little bit more detail here. And this, I'm not sure, but I imagine that many of the participants were not up to speed on this when they walked into the room the first day of this 3-day session. And so it's real testament to the facilitators that they were able to get this across in an inspiring way and get people on board. Because the process consisted of, first of all, to identify 2 or 3 principal components of future variability. And to me, this was the most important part of this whole phase. It actually, and that sounds a little bit like this crazy, wild idea notion that I was peddling for science fiction, although we're talking 2 or 3 such things here. I think there is some relation in terms of trying to identify what are the critical things that are affecting this future that you are talking about. And properly chosen principal components can, and this is also true of the one crazy idea, a properly chosen crazy idea or a properly chosen principal component can unify the issues, the uncertainty issues. For instance, if you can parameterize your principal component, then you can talk about different levels of consequence that it can have. By having 2 or 3 such principal components, you could actually geometrize the situation. You could imagine something that depended on 2 sorts of things. For instance, an example might be Moore's law, the future effectiveness of super small, large-scale integration. So that's one component. It's easy to parameterize that. In fact, the parameterization of that with respect to time is what Moore's law is. And you could imagine another component is cost per kilogram of delta V. Or another way, cost to low Earth orbit per kilogram. We have been stuck for decades with $5,000 to $10,000 a pound to low Earth orbit. That's a point where that principal component would lie and would say something. On the other hand, we're looking at very, very fast computers. That combination of those 2 things gives us a world. It gives us a world essentially without manned spaceflight, but with enormous progress in computers and actually enormous progress with robotic astronauts. So you could imagine in 1980, having a meeting where people are talking about, suppose it's an aerospace companies, and if they come up with these 2 principal components, we'll look at the possibility that computers are going to get a whole lot faster, and the possibility that spaceflight will become a whole lot cheaper. And if you think of those as orthogonal components, you can actually scope out a terrain of different possibilities. The one we ended up with would probably if it was a well-run session, it probably would have been one of the scenarios, and they would have had some really ugly name for it, like stuck with Frankenstein at the bottom of a gravity well, or some crazy thing like that. Or if they thought it was attractive, if they wanted to be neutral about it, the name has to be short and pithy for the scenario. But you can imagine with 2 principal components, you can scope out things that can happen in each of the 4 quadrants. And let me see if I actually point this out properly here. One thing that, I don't know whether it's obvious or not, but if you're in that sort of a scenario creation protocol, it's good to identify the principal components, but then come up with scenarios for different places in that terrain. And these scenarios, it's probably wise if they are extreme. If you still want to make them plausible, but by making them extreme, you make them more noteworthy in the minds of the observers that look at it later. If you do not succeed in making them individually plausible, then you've lost. But if for most of your observers that's not the case, if you can make them plausible, then having staked out the territory in this parameter space is something that could really make a difference to the people who have to read your deliverables. One thing to keep in mind is that you're not claiming that the scenarios are predictions. And if you fall in love with one particular scenario, you should keep that to yourself. On the other hand, if you are a facilitator, you're going to have to deal with the Billy Mitchells that are in the crowd. If you recall, Billy Mitchell was an Army general who was convinced that air power was going to make all the difference. This was coming out of World War I. And he got himself court-martialed. He was so stuck on that. He was right, but he was so stuck on it. There are always going to be people like that. Now, most of them are going to be wrong, but they'll be just as committed as Billy Mitchell was. And if you're dealing with some of those on your team, then you have to turn that potential problem into a strength. And that is, let them work on the scenario that they want, just prevent it from disabling and bulldozing all the other scenarios that are out there. And if you do it that way, then they actually can be a great value to you. There's another thing that didn't come up until I was actually researching for this talk, and I went and looked at what some of the stuff Peter Schwartz wrote. Do you think that this sort of process could work in a totalitarian country? Would Joe Stalin have liked to use scenario-based planning? Well, unless he could fool the participants into participating, I can't imagine anybody who would willingly go out and talk openly around a table with 15 or 20 of the other experts about what's going to happen in the future. Because although when you talk about the scenarios, you're not supposed to be talking about it as something that you think is your favorite or you think that is really going to happen, anything you say could be interpreted by a sufficiently paranoid mind as a statement of your beliefs. So I don't think it'd be wise to do this for Joe Stalin. Or for doing it for any sort of CEO that was actually looking for traitors in-house. And if you look at Peter Schwartz's second book, he has a spectacular and horrifying example of that. So coming back from that that digression into how things can go terribly wrong within the process, there is the goal of making each of the scenarios as plausible as you can. And there's no way I could have ever been a facilitator. What those guys managed to do in terms of keeping everybody on track and producing something that and oftentimes was wonderful is really great. The last phase was the deliverables. So in the GBN approach, this was multiple scenarios taken from their parameter space, and you'd have deliverables presumably about each of them. Now, I looked at the 2049 project, and there are obvious differences, but I think talking about the deliverables and talking about the process there's plenty of overlap that may give helpful ideas, even though the rules of the competition and the project should definitely come from the project administrators, not from anything that outside people are misinterpreting. Types of deliverables. The first 4 are ones that I actually see from looking at the website for the 2049 competition. So a paper, a story describing the scenario, and I've talked plenty about writing stories, so if it's a science fiction story, some of that might apply. A film, a game, which is actually a type of simulation in a way, but it's a simulation that that convinces the participants by the way they play it of what the hidden rules and outcomes are. And then there's things like this, which may not occur immediately, but I think is a powerful psychological tool, and that is to write a faux historical essay in which you pretend to be a historian from the future, not too far in the future, say 10 or 15 years after the scenario in question has happened, and after everybody is on board and is totally accepted that the scenario has happened. This essay would be an explanation for why, in retrospect, the scenario's development, the scenario coming to pass, was inevitable and obvious. And there's something about the tone of such essays. You know, we've all read essays about that in the real world where somebody says, well, it was obvious that the internet was going to do all this and blah, blah, blah. People were just too foolish to see it at the time. The symptoms were there, they could have seen it. Writing an essay like that, I think, actually has a certain, in a way, in a limited way, it has something of the charm of a science fiction story. And then, of course, you can actually write action plans for preventing or mitigating scenarios that you really don't like, or encouraging scenarios that you really do like. The last thing on my list here, and the last thing for my talk, is the notion of scenario presaging symptoms. Make a symptom list of what would you expect to see happen in the time from now to the time that the particular scenario you're talking about has come to pass. What are those symptoms? Those are things for people to watch for. And in the case of a situation where you have a bunch of scenarios that say were done on the same terrain of principal components, or if they were simply similar enough that they could be talked about in the same worldview, I think that the symptoms list is something that suggests a post-project methodology. And that is, you do your methodology stuff, however you're doing it, with the San Diego 24/9 process or the GBN type process. You do it, you have your deliverables out there, and then after everybody goes away or goes away from the organizations that produce those, you have people who have read the scenarios. And they're looking around, and if the scenarios were engaging enough, they sort of stick in their mind, even if they don't believe them at all. And they've read the symptoms list. And so as time goes on and they're looking at the headlines and the things that are happening in the real world, they may occasionally say things, isn't that a little bit like that story, that science fiction story, or isn't that a little bit like that scenario symptom list item that I saw for that crazy, crazy scenario a couple years ago? Now, an observer like that is in a position where he may actually make much more note of it and take it seriously than someone who is convinced of the future and just sees any deviations, any surprises to their point of view as statistical fluctuations to be dismissed. So if you're on the lookout for the symptoms, especially of coordinated scenarios, you're in a position where you can actually work with them. For instance, if you see a scenario, it may suggest certain things that you should do just to position yourself in case it turns out that that scenario happens. There may even be ways that if you have a bunch of scenarios that have coordinated symptoms lists, that you may be able to see how there are certain symptoms that apply to more than one scenario, but that they have the same defensive move. And so in a way, you can kill two birds with one stone. You stay adapted to do two different, perhaps quite different, future scenarios by making one strategy move. So there's really a lot of things that can go on to dealing with a really good set of scenarios that have come out of any sort of exercise like that. So anyway, those are my comments about scenarios in science fiction and scenarios in scenario projects. Thank you.
And we have time for a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll run the mic over to you. We'll start up front here with Dave.
Hi, Vernor. That was terrific. I just wanted to plug a project that Patrick Coleman took lead in at the Clarke Center that is related to this. It's called TASAT. You know about it. There's a story about that. And that's because I've done similar consultations, and I've long wanted to be able to say to some of our customers who hire us crackpots, that there's a place you can go if you come up with any scenario, and a whole bunch nerdish community would be able to cite past science fiction stories, even going back 50, 60 years. So the address is tasat.ucsd.edu, I think. And Patrick Coleman here was lead in implementing it.
Huh.
And now it's being, starting to gain a little bit of momentum. I thought I dragged you
No,
into this.
You haven't dragged me into it, but it's a terrific idea, and it ensnares a lot of horsepower, namely all those years that we spent lip flapping about, oh, that's just this other story, or that reminds me of this other story, to give all that horsepower a constructive location where it can, be written down, I think is really
Well, it needs a critical mass of nerdy types, but
They're out there, they're just not.
if we can get enough of them into it, then anytime the government or a corporation or somebody discovers mole people are coming out of the ground,
Right.
or fairies are real, clap your hands, there's a story about that.
Thanks for the interesting talk. What's your favorite example of a particularly successful scenario building project, either predictive or proscriptive?
Actually, the ones at GBN I'd rather not talk about, partly because my memory would not be faithful, but partly because they probably don't want me to, go into which industrial scenarios were the most effective. In science fiction, I think that 1984 probably did some good. That it alerted people, and in that case, it wasn't necessarily the future only. It was things that were actually going on in the present and the immediate past. That overall, it I think had an effect.
Self-preventing prophecy.
Yeah, self-preventing prophecies. I think there are some writers that can point to places where they have managed to do that.
That's cheating a bit, though. It's tied too closely to the today.
Yeah.
I want something out of it.
Oh, well, so the outside of GBN, the types of scenarios I do are science fiction, and we, meaning science fiction writers, did a rather comprehensive job on that with nukes. I can remember showing my father once a couple pages of, probably from Heinlein's Solution Unsatisfactory, and he's reading it. And I picked 2 pages that, where, you can do this if you're careful about it, where he didn't say anything that was wrong. He just, home run after home run after home run. And my father read it and says, so this is a story of the Manhattan Project, right? And it was written, before Hiroshima. Now, there is some evidence that some people knew what was going on in the Manhattan Project. And many years later, Campbell wrote, I think, had some interviews. The FBI came and interviewed him about some of these stories. And he was very adamant that, these guys just write these crazy stuff. And when they went out and interviewed the writers were cagey, and they said, oh, this was Campbell, he suggested this idea to me. And Campbell did a lot of that. He said, I was really glad when those guys left that they didn't go into the back room. Because in the back room, he said, I had this map of the USA with a little pinhead stuck every place where I had a subscriber. And there were these two huge blots out in the middle of nowhere. One was somewhere in Tennessee, and the other was Los Alamos. So that probably wouldn't hard to explain. There is one scenario. There was one terrific writer, Will Jenkins, who really wrote as a flat-out, professional science fiction writer, but he was very imaginative, and he also worked with Campbell. And he wrote a story called The Murder of the USA in 1948. And he has all sorts of stuff in that, he has synthetic aperture stuff going on. He has fobs, fractional orbital bombardment systems. And the story is about nuclear attribution. And it is really just an absolutely chilling story about, if you get hit, and you can't tell who hit you. And thank God that story was a scenario that never played out. But I'm not quite sure what his solutions I thought was quite unsatisfactory, but I'm not quite sure what effect that had. But proliferation was very much, in fact, there were very few non-proliferation stories in the 40s. They all caught up on the idea of proliferation. I think if you had tried to peddle to Campbell a story about non-proliferation, that it didn't, that it happened so slowly, you would have probably been, the story probably would have been rejected just on the basis that it didn't pass Campbell's sniff test.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm an aspiring writer myself, and I've noticed that with a lot of the stories that I create, my stronger suits are world building and character development, but what would you recommend in terms of creating a good plot?
How to create a good plot. Oh, well, if you're talking about science fiction, one nice thing you have is that you can accentuate the various character plot things. There are things about characters that can tug on the heartstrings, and with science fiction, you can really intensify that by the types of gimmicks that you have. So that, for instance, there's been a lot of stories about time dilation and what that does to romance. Two characters that one may be an older person and the other is a younger person at the beginning of the story. And at the end of the story, one is an older person, the other is a younger person, but it's reversed because of something like that. So my ex-wife, Joan D. Vinge, wrote a story about that, about where the sweet young thing actually went off into space and actually, in the end, was the person that was not the ephemeral person. The ephemeral person turned out to be the spacer who had stayed on the Earth.
In your Zones of Thought series, you talk about Pham Nguyen and his partner, was it Ravna, I think? That they were planning for centuries. They're deep space travelers. And one of the mechanisms they relied on is archives of knowledge hidden on distant planets. How important is it to us to store archives that can survive planetary disaster?
Oh, I think it's quite important, and it's harder than the most simple-minded analysis would indicate. But it's actually, I think, it's a lot easier than what some people worry about. It does take some very special. If you really mean a long time, it takes some very special effort. But I don't think it's hard, and I'd be not as a part, not taking up the time here. But I'd be happy to blather about that. I had an interesting discussion with David Weber. We were talking about how long it would take to come back after a crunch. And we both ended up agreeing. He had to convince me, but he did convince me that if the number of humans that survived a disaster was reproductively sufficient, that we would come back very, very fast, and that in most cases we would come back within a single human lifetime. And part of that is just the evidence of the archives and all those raw materials lying around on the surface. And the other, and maybe the most important thing, is knowing what is possible. If you're living in the year 100 in Rome, you have no concept for what can be done with machines. And if a large number of people in that early time had just known what machines could do, the swivel of attention was focused down. It would not have just been Heron and Archimedes and a few other guys, peddling around with something that got lost as soon as they got killed. It would have been an intense movement, and I think by the year 1000 we'd be where we are now. And that is without any archives. That's just with the understanding that, yeah, you really can fly, and in a lot of different ways.
They have the memory of that reality.
Right, the conviction that it can be done, and that by itself, I think, would do it, not in one lifetime, but quickly.
In the Rainbow's End scenario, there's a lot of symptoms, augmented reality, crowdsourced chemical development, a lot of things like that are reality in 2018. Should we be concerned about mind control, or is that kind of just too far into that scenario? Because we're seeing a lot of the symptoms of that scenario laid out.
Now, mind control is an example of one of those orthogonal things that I think could happen. The obvious threat is just Internet of Things. We don't need mind control to just have a lot of trouble with Internet of Things. But one thing I do in talks when I talk about the Internet of Things is just imagine, with the Internet of Things, we can give reality the same firm solidity that we presently attribute to financial markets. So, for instance, in this room, if I let go of this sheaf of papers, there's a limited number of things that can happen. I may be surprised, but I wasn't very surprised. It moved downwards. It got stopped by the table. In an Internet of Things, neither of those is possible. Neither of those is nearly as likely. As far as the mind control thing goes, unfortunately, that's an illustration of something that actually you could make plausible scenarios for that. And if it happens, it looks like it would still come as a big surprise. By mind control, I assume you don't mean just enhanced propaganda. You mean something that really, you can...
The plot line for Rainbow's End.
Right. Oh yeah, they were running scared from the possibility that would happen. I think the tools that they actually had, they could do limited things, like they could confuse people. The chief character, who was both the hero and the villain of the story, was convinced that the labs out here, the biolabs out here, were working on a method for taking over minds. And actually, the guy who had that fear, it was well founded, because he was actually the person who was behind the labs.
Thank you for your talk. I was interested in your comment about scenario building and Stalin and totalitarianism. And maybe it was just a throwaway comment, but I wondered what you thought about the rich tradition of Soviet science fiction.
Yeah, that actually is a nice contrast. I think you're talking about people that were written by people that were staying in the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah,
Right.
Yeah. During the whole Soviet
period. I think that
period.
they actually, for the most part, were pretty careful about what they wrote. And there were periods when it was easier to write some things and other things. During the depths of Stalin's position, science fiction that was written in the depths of the purge would have been very interesting and very difficult to write, and probably rather fawning. So if you have examples from what was this, the 1930s, where he was really going strong, that would be the worst. If it's in the 50s and 60s, where you're gradually, I can remember reading essays where they were trying to figure out some way we can bottle the good parts of capitalism without the bad parts. And they were kind of trying to figure out ways of doing that. And I think you could still get into trouble, but if you were somewhat careful, you could probably, you could write the neat stories that did get written.
Sorry, I sort of prepared something to ask. So I just finished reading this book, Marge Piercy's sci-fi Woman on the Edge of Time. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I'm sorry, say the title again?
It's Woman on the Edge of Time.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Okay. Well, it's a story where a woman protagonist is institutionalized against her will, and she travels to a future utopian society where basically issues such as environmental pollution, patriarchy, homelessness, homophobia, racism, sexism, consumerism, they've all essentially been, and inequality have all essentially been dealt with. And so this kind of story embodies like a counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s that have kind of had a resurgence today. And one of the main themes in the story is we don't know if this future society is real or if it's all in her head. And so this kind of enters into beautiful mind territory where, genius and madness sort of intersect. And so I'm wondering if you have ever experienced, being on the edge of madness. And if that helped or hindered your creativity, your process for imagination.
So far, no one's caught me at clinical extremes. However, there's at least two situations where dreams actually did inform stories, the central features of stories.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Oh, they're not, and actually, this also includes non-science fiction stuff. I've been working for at least 6 weeks on maybe the final thing that would push my PhD thesis over the edge of having enough. You know, okay, this is enough. We'll get you out of here. It's been about 6 weeks, and I woke up one morning and while I was sort of drowsing, I figured out a way of doing the proof with about 3 lines. That's good news in a way because it was very bright. It changed this incredible delta epsilon grinding into just 2 or 3 lines. The bad news was, does that still push it over the edge? Fortunately, it did. But in science fiction, the fundamental idea of the peace war was actually a part of a dream. Oh, wow. And there's at least one other one that was science fiction that was part of a dream. There's been 1 or 2 papers astronautical papers that came out of as I'm waking up. But the thing in the peace war actually was frankly within a dream. It was not one of these waking up things where all of a sudden everything clicks. There's a person over. Oh, I'm not tracking everything, but I noticed one person over here seemed to be asking from before.
Okay, so what is your big, crazy, wild idea of 2049? When you look out there and you think, what's going to happen? What's the one you want to dish us up so that we can just enjoy it?
Unfortunately, I said that predicting scenarios that involve predicting futures that involve humans is very, very hard. There actually is a terrible, terrible thing that's much harder, and that is something that I think has impacted science fiction writers since at least the 1970s, and that is the singularity. That if you have things that come along that are smarter than humans, then everything that we've been saying about the intractability of dealing with human futures gets to be much, much, much worse. In fact, the reason why I think that the term singularity is a good term for such an event is that it's like singularity in modeling, where you have a model that blows up at a certain point. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the world is going to blow up, but it does mean that you need some other model. And so I think that science fiction writers is the first occupational group that has been economically impacted by the singularity. And that is true even if the singularity doesn't happen. Because there's all these readers out there, or there are some readers out there who really do believe the singularity is going to happen. And how do you write a story that happens after the singularity? Because these readers and you, presumably, are all not superhumanly intelligent. So there's a real problem there. And we science fiction writers have various ways we've remained economically viable in the face of that.
Can you tell us what the Peter Schwartz horrific example was?
Oh, he filed off all the serial numbers. But he said that, and this is a book that's out there because I have the citation there. But basically, he said that they had no idea that this was going on. But then after they turned in the deliverables, there were all sorts of people that got fired from the company. So they were just horrified by this, and he said it was a very surprising and very ugly lesson. No, actually, it was pretty clearly not that. It was some sort of natural resources company of some sort.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone?
Hi, I have a writing craft question. I came here via the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. Anybody else? That lady who invited me? Maybe? Okay, no? Okay. So I was really interested in your comment about megalomaniac science fiction writers who can enlist armies of geniuses. One of the conversations we have frequently in Kid Lit is using literature to affect social change, no matter which genre we're writing in. So I know it's possible to bring attention to issues, but is there a way to really get people to act based on your writing, do you think?
I think that probably is true. I'm not sure that it's how it would compare to activism, where you actually go out and very explicitly are trying to, enlist people and going at a certain thing, going in supporting certain measures. But I think that if you look at stories like Fahrenheit 451 in 1984, and that there's some evidence that this, well, actually another one that I didn't bring up because it doesn't fit with my narrative all that well, but that's Animal Farm. Mm-hmm. That Animal Farm actually made a bigger impression on me than 1984 did. That these are things that can, enlist people. So beyond science fiction, just writing things that are very intense that may be fictional, this really can have an effect, I think, and it'd be interesting to. If I had other names that I could pop up here that have had particular effects. Oh yeah, yeah. That's Harry Harrison, right? And then it became a movie, right?
All right. Well, let's give our author a round of applause.
Thank you.